The gunman behind the deadliest mass shooting in U.S. history may have plotted to kill others with a car bomb, and it seems he had an escape plan. The NRA backs new rules on gun accessories, and is the president ready to pull out of the Iran nuclear deal, or maybe something just short of that? This is Special Report. Good evening, welcome to Washington. I'm Brett Baer. A possible car bomb, scouting other locations, an escape plan, and the belief he could not have acted alone. These are just some of the headlines about the suspect behind Sunday's shooting that left 58 people dead and hundreds injured. While police try to figure out a motive, a bipartisan group of lawmakers and even the National Rifle Association, the NRA, are now saying there should be new rules when it comes to gun accessories like the bump stock. We have Fox Team coverage. Chief Congressional Correspondent Mike Emanuel is live on Capitol Hill with that part of the story. But we begin with correspondent Trace Gallagher, who joins us tonight from Las Vegas with all of the new developments in this investigation. Good evening, Trace.
Good evening, Brett. Let's start with that breaking news about possibility of other attacks, including a car bomb. You will recall that in the Mandalay Bay, the car of Stephen Paddock was actually found with 1,600 rounds of ammunition, some ammonium nitrate, the same thing that was used in the Oklahoma City bombing by Tim McVeigh, and 50 pounds of tannerite. There were no targets described in the threat, or at least U.S. officials didn't notify us of any targets, and they say they are still looking for a motive to the shooting. Other cities are responding to claims that Las Vegas shooter Stephen Paddock may have considered targeting them as well. Late today, Chicago police told Fox News that it believes Paddock booked 2 rooms at this hotel overlooking the Lollapalooza Music Festival this summer. Also saying, quote, the city conducts extensive public safety planning and training around major events in close coordination with our law enforcement partners to ensure public safety. Another reported location, Boston.
We and many others are fully plugged in on that investigation, and there is no imminent threat to anything in Massachusetts or New England.
Last night, officials said Paddock may have also had additional Las Vegas targets. He rented a room in September near the Life is Beautiful Music Festival.
As many of you already reported, Paddock rented a room at the Ogden Hotel in downtown Las Vegas. We have recovered video from there to review Mr. Paddock's actions while he was there.
Investigators are acknowledging that they may never fully understand what pushed the man they're calling disturbed and dangerous to carry out the worst domestic attack in U.S. history.
What we know is Stephen Paddock is a man who spent decades acquiring weapons and ammo and living a secret life, much of which will never be fully understood. One
thing they do believe is that Paddock probably didn't act completely on his own.
Do you think this was all accomplished on his own? You got to make the assumption that he had to have some help at some point.
Other revelations, Paddock intended to survive the attack.
He was doing everything possible to figure out how he could escape at that point. His concern was personal concern versus what was occurring down below him.
The FBI spent hours yesterday questioning Marilou Danley, Paddock's girlfriend, after her return from the Philippines. Danley is cooperating and said she knew Paddock as a, quote, kind, caring, quiet man. Her lawyer shared her statement.
He never said anything to me or took any action that I was aware of that I understood in any way to be a warning that something horrible like this was going to happen. Anything I can do to help ease suffering and help in any way, I will do.
As hospitals continue to treat the injured, the death toll has remained at 58.
As of 9:34 p.m. yesterday, we have officially identified all 58 victims and 1 suspect that have been involved in this incident, as well as notified all of the next of kins, which is a big deal.
Yet with so many questions still remaining, investigators are predicting a long road ahead.
There's a lot of information that's going to change over time as we determine more facts. But this is what I can tell you. Our resolve is firm. We will get to the bottom of this, no matter how long it takes.
And the Clark County Sheriff is on record saying that he believes Paddock had an accomplice. What's interesting is we are now learning that in the days leading up to the massacre that he was gambling extensively for 7-8 hours at a time, and there are reports he had a female companion with him, not his girlfriend, during that time. Police are now in the process of trying to track down that companion. A last note, Brett, we should tell you there was a bomb threat at the Mandalay Bay a short time ago. The all clear has now been given. Brett.
Tense time as that investigation continues. Trace Gallagher live on the Strip. Trace, thanks. Sunday's shooting in Las Vegas sparked a renewed national debate over gun control, and today an incredible shift in tone as many Democrats, Republicans, and even the National Rifle Association seem to agree on something. Chief Congressional Correspondent Mike Emanuel reports from Capitol Hill on today's big developments.
In the aftermath of the Las Vegas massacre, members of both parties are looking to take action on bump stocks, add-on devices that make semi-automatic weapons more deadly.
The Congress can do more than send thoughts and prayers after these tragedies. And even though this is a relatively minor adjustment, if we could act in concert, I think it would be a great signal to the country.
That's what we want to prevent. For someone to be able to fire 400, 500, 800 rounds per minute, most Americans, and I would say most members of Congress, understand that the laws as they exist today are designed to prevent that.
Those lawmakers are backing restrictions on bump stocks, but one House conservative isn't sold on legislation targeting the add-ons.
He had a whole arsenal of weapons, and if he wanted to kill many people, he could have used a number of different things. We didn't outlaw 747s after 9/11.
However, top House Republicans have opened the door to a legislative response.
Apparently, this allows you to take a semi-automatic, turn it into fully automatic, so clearly that's something we need to look into.
And the National Rifle Association agrees, but stops short of backing legislation, saying the organization believes the devices, quote, should be subject to additional regulations. For those worried about a bump stock bill being a slippery slope on gun control, House Democratic Leader Nancy Pelosi says,
I certainly hope so. But I don't think bump stock should be a substitute for the background check.
And others clearly want to go further.
If this majority believes that a bump stock prohibition is enough, they've been smoking something.
White House Press Secretary Sarah Sanders says the president is listening.
We certainly welcome that, would like to be part of that conversation.
Nevada Republican Senator Dean Heller says he's willing to look at ways to prevent another attack like Las Vegas.
You show me the law that would stop that. Not only will I support it, I'll be an advocate for that law.
What is striking is how many lawmakers who say they had never heard of a bump stock until this week. Even Speaker Paul Ryan, who describes himself as an avid sportsman. Brett?
Mike, what's the latest news with the budget? That, of course, sets the table for tax reform.
No question about it. $4.1 trillion budget passed the House today. The vote was 219 to 206 along party lines. A big part of the pitch is this is a critical step in order to do tax reform. Adopting a budget would allow the Senate to pass tax reform with 51 yes votes instead of 60. So we've heard a lot of Republican leaders saying essentially this is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to fix the tax code. It also passed the Senate Budget Committee today. It's expected on the Senate floor later this month. Brett?
We will track that. Mike, thank you. Pennsylvania Congressman Tim Murphy is resigning later this month. The Republican congressman made headlines for an alleged affair during which he reportedly urged his mistress to have an abortion despite his firm pro-life stance. House Speaker Paul Ryan accepted the congressman's resignation today, saying he thinks it's appropriate that Murphy move on. Democrat sources on the Hill tell Fox that Democratic Congresswoman Linda Sanchez regrets saying that it is time to be out with the old and in with the new when it comes to Democratic House leadership, a comment that definitely raised some eyebrows in her caucus today.
We have this real breadth and depth of talent within our caucus, and I do think it's time to pass the torch to a new generation of leaders.
Sanchez made that bold call for Democratic House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi and other minority leaders to step aside in an interview today. Pelosi is 77 years old and has served in Congress since 1987, leading House Democrats for 14 of those years. Congresswoman Sanchez also included House Minority Whip Steny Hoyer and House Assistant Minority Leader James Clyburn in her call to pass the torch to a younger generation. Fox News is told Democratic members were utterly incensed by her comments, although many would admit it is a conversation worth having. This time next week, President Trump could begin to dismantle one of the Obama administration's biggest agreements, the Iran nuclear deal. Multiple reports here in Washington now indicate that the president plans to announce that he will decertify the deal, saying it's not in the national interest of the United States. While the White House is pushing back on the notion that anything is completely set in stone, lawmakers on Capitol Hill seem to think the question about the future of Iran sanctions will, in fact, end up back in their laps. Correspondent Kevin Corke is at the White House tonight with what we're learning. Good evening, Kevin.
Hey there, Brett. You're right about that. In fact, at this hour, the president is meeting with his senior military cadre here at the White House. No doubt the Iran nuclear deal would be among the topics they would discuss. Now, October 15th is the date by which the president has to choose whether to certify or recertify or simply get rid of the Iran nuclear deal. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but that decision is playing out against a backdrop of a fierce debate inside the administration over whether to strengthen it or get rid of it altogether.
The president's team has presented a united strategy that the national security team all stands behind and supports, and the president will make that announcement soon.
With an October 15th certification deadline looming, White House officials today acknowledged that President Trump has already made a decision about the future of U.S. participation in the Iran nuclear agreement, a decision made after consultation with an experienced senior cadre with different viewpoints on whether the U.S. should remain a party to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action.
Iran is not in material breach of the agreement.
I believe at this point in time, absent indications to the contrary, it is something the president should consider staying with.
While Generals Mattis and Dunford think there's merit to staying in the deal, the president could decide to withdraw the U.S. altogether or stop just short by decertifying the deal but adding more sanctions. Decertification would come by way of the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act, which requires the president every 90 days to determine whether the deal is in the best interest of the U.S. It's a U.S. law, by the way, so it's not subject to the international deal struck with the Iranians. It calls on the president to certify that Iran is transparently, verifiably, and fully implementing the agreement, and that continuing the JCPOA is vital to national security. A high bar, says UN Ambassador Nikki Haley.
If he thinks that the deal is, that the situation is not in the best interests of the American public, then he doesn't certify it.
It's possible that Haley tipped the administration's hand in a tweet yesterday, praising Arkansas Senator Tom Cotton's clear understanding of the Iranian regime. Cotton, who met with the president today in the Oval Office, has repeatedly called for the administration to abandon the deal.
Frankly, that deal is an embarrassment to the United States, and I don't think you've heard the last of it. Believe me.
2 weeks ago, the president called the Iran deal an embarrassment, but experts warn that doesn't mean he's any more likely to abandon the accord or have the final say on it.
The final decision would go back to the Congress under the terms of the Corker-Cardin legislation, and it would give Congress 60 days to make a decision about how to respond to the president's decision that presumably the agreement is not in U.S. national interest.
Plenty of criticism on Capitol Hill in particular if the president were to decide to pull the U.S. out of the deal. Brett, Jack Reed, a senator from the state of Rhode Island, a Democrat, saying that it would be a costly strategic mistake for the U.S. to pull out of the deal. He said it would frankly isolate us from our allies and partners. Now, as you point out, we could hear perhaps by Wednesday if the president wants to make a broader speech about Iran policy. White House pushing back on that tonight. We'll just have to wait and see, Brett.
And we'll see if he says anything with the military leaders he's meeting with tonight at the White House. Kevin Corke live in the North Lawn. Kevin, thanks. Hackers working for the Russian government may have stolen highly classified secrets on how the U.S. gets into foreign computer networks and defends against cyber attacks. That report by the Wall Street Journal says hackers got the material after a National Security Agency contractor put it on his home computer. If true, experts say the hack would be one of the most significant security breaches in years. Officials with the NSC at the White House and on Capitol Hill would not comment publicly on the story. Multiple U.S. Army commandos were killed in an ambush in West Africa yesterday, and officials now believe an al-Qaeda affiliate is to blame in a region now teeming with terrorists from ISIS, Boko Haram, and al-Qaeda. Lucas Tomlinson is at the Pentagon tonight with the latest.
clearly there's risk for our forces in Niger.
3 U.S. Army Green Berets were killed in an ambush in the landlocked West African nation late Wednesday afternoon. 2 other Special Forces soldiers were wounded and flown to a military hospital in Germany, where they are expected to recover. 10 Green Berets in all were attacked 120 miles north of Niger's capital, near the border with Mali. Officials say they were on a routine patrol accompanying local forces, who the U.S. military has been training for over a decade. The terror group Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, or AQIM, is suspected of carrying out the deadly attack. U.S. officials tell Fox, as ISIS fighters are squeezed out of Syria and Iraq, they have found a safe haven in West Africa. At the Pentagon, a senior Marine Corps general didn't deny it.
It is inevitable that people will try to go what we call the coldest corner of the room, go to other places. They tried to go to Libya. It didn't work out real well.
Officials tell Fox there was no U.S. surveillance drone overhead at the time of the attack. The Pentagon would not confirm.
We're not prepared to go into any details on them right now.
There are roughly 6,000 U.S. troops on the African continent, 800 now on the ground in Niger, mostly stationed at 2 air bases. General McKenzie says more U.S. troops have arrived recently to support a second drone base inside Niger. But the local government doesn't allow armed drone flights to protect U.S. troops, despite repeated requests from the U.S. military. The State Department has warned of repeated cross-border attacks and kidnappings by AQIM from Mali, even in the face of efforts from the French military, which has battled the terrorist group for years. Officials note that AQIM terrorists were behind the deadly attack on a large gas plant in Algeria 4 years ago, where they took hundreds of hostages, including 7 Americans. 3 were killed. Months later, the U.S. military signed the agreement to bring drones to Niger to gather more intelligence on the terror group. The names of the American soldiers killed in yesterday's attack will be released after the family members are notified. Brett?
Lucas Tomlinson live at the Pentagon. Lucas, thank you. Let's get some analysis on the situation in Niger. Retired Green Beret Michael Waltz, who also served as senior counterterrorism advisor to Vice President Dick Cheney, joins us here to talk about it. Mike, good evening. Tell me about this. We don't often hear about the efforts of Green Berets who are working with local indigenous forces, as they do, but they're kicking in doors and going after terrorists in this region.
That's right. Well, Brett, I think it's important to point out that as we speak right now, every day, American Green Berets, Special Forces in general, are operating in 70 to 80 countries around the world.
70 to 80.
70 to 80. You know, as we deal with our domestic issues and we sleep safe tonight, they are in half the countries around the world doing America's business. Now, in Niger, specifically, where I had the opportunity to serve in 2014, you know, it's really a hotbed. If you look at it geographically, you've got Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb in Mali, next door to the northwest, where actually we have an American aid worker being held hostage right now as we speak as well. We have Boko Haram in Nigeria to the south, and then you have, importantly, you have ISIS to the north in Libya, which just completely fell apart under the Obama administration after the overthrow of Gaddafi, and that's what a lot of the drones and the training has been focused on.
And as this administration essentially drops the hammer on terrorists and ISIS in Iraq and Syria, it's kind of like a water balloon. They go someplace else, and West Africa has been that someplace else.
Yeah, as you squeeze in Raqqa and in northern Iraq, you're seeing ISIS flow out to Afghanistan. That's why the president's strategy to stay engaged there is so important. You've seen ISIS just take over a city in southern Philippines, and you're seeing them hot and heavy in western Iraq. And, you know, that's what our Green Berets are so important to do. They uniquely specialize in training local forces for the long term so they can take the fight on their own. We have to have hard power in the short term, but in the long term, we have to undermine the ideology and we have to train our partners to take the fight to the enemy.
Mike, we're getting ready to go to the White House. The president meeting with his military leaders, the defense secretary, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and others in the cabinet room in the White House. Yeah. Stand by if you would. The press allowed in for a short time. The president made some comments on both Iran and bump stocks. We can take that tape as it comes in from the cabinet room. Let's listen.
Does the NRA announcement provide some affirmation of the need to make a change?
Thank you all very much. Thank you. You'll be hearing about Iran very shortly. Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Okay, that wasn't exactly chock full of news, saying you'll hear about Iran very shortly. We'll see if he said anything else before that. He's meeting there. Likely this topic's coming up. If his military leaders are there, you have just this raid in Niger and obviously a serious situation for special forces on the ground.
That's right, Brett, and this is why it's so important for us to stay engaged, for the American people to understand that we have these operators all over the world. And, you know, if you look at success stories like Colombia against the FARC, like the Philippines and others, it's because we had a very small footprint. By doctrine, you can have 12 of these special operators training thousands of locals, and I think that's the long-term strategy in this long war. And I just ask you and everyone else, Brett, to keep the families in mind tonight. I understand the bodies are coming back to Dover this weekend, and it's things like it's veterans organizations like the Green Beret Foundation and others that are going to support the families who are suffering in this long effort.
That's a great reminder. Thank you very much, Mike. By the way, the president said about bump stocks, we'll be looking into that in a period of time. So basically said the same thing about Iran. Up next, President Trump's travel ban faces its next test in front of the U.S. Supreme Court. Isn't case closed on President Trump's travel ban? Attorneys on both sides of the issue faced a noon deadline today to file briefs over whether the third rollout of the ban means there is nothing left for the U.S. Supreme Court to decide. Chief Legal Correspondent Shannon Bream joins me now with what the arguments will be and where it goes from here. Good evening, Shannon.
Hello. All right, so here's the deal. They both filed today. The administration says there's nothing for the court to do here, that this third issue that they have put out, this third order, is materially different from the other two, so there's nothing for them to decide. They want the court to move on. They said this today. If this court were to continue to hear these appeals, it would be asked to decide questions with no ongoing practical import. They say that this third order, they're calling it a proclamation. They say it's based on totally different criteria and it's a different ballgame altogether. Now, the opponents say, no, these three executive actions are virtually the same thing. They want the court to weigh in. So today they told them this, quote, the issuance of the third version does not render this case moot because it extends rather than eliminates the challenged conduct at issue. So from that position, they want the court to lump all three of these orders together, and they want them to rule it unconstitutional as the lower courts have done.
It did evolve, though. I mean, there is the stipulation that if these countries meet the visa requirements in their country, they could get off the list. But what happens now? Well,
the justices, as you know, are in the full term right now, so they're hearing and arguing other cases. But these briefs are not very substantive. I mean, they're short relative to everything else they're considering. They do act very quickly in most of these cases, so I would expect that to happen rather quickly. There's a lot at stake for the administration if the justices decide to hear the case. Both sides agree on that.
Having a ruling coming from the Supreme Court, including a Supreme Court that has a conservative majority, would be a huge blow to the Trump administration.
But any time an administration tees up one of these issues for the Supreme Court, they're running a real risk that the Supreme Court is going to say you've gone too far, you've overstepped your boundaries, and that has very significant consequences.
So, Brett, not a surprise that they also disagree about what happens if the court says we're not going to hear the case. The administration, of course, wants those lower court rulings that are against the travel ban, all the versions so far. They want those tossed. The other side says, no, they're good law. Keep them in place while this is being litigated.
Okay, we will follow every step. Shannon, thank you. President Trump's tough talk about illegal immigration is leading some to run for the border of Canada. Correspondent Molly Line reports from Canada about the increase in illegal border crossings there and how the country is handling the added load.
They are pouring in from around the globe, people seeking asylum, leaving America for Canada.
Most of the people want to come to Canada to become Canadian citizens.
More than 13,000 crossing the border illegally this year, according to Canadian government data. That's 5 times the number intercepted by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police in 2016. The summer surge was dramatic. In Quebec, authorities set up a temporary camp near the border, and in Montreal, officials converted the former Olympic Stadium into a shelter. More than 5,700 asylum seekers crossed illegally in August alone, avoiding checkpoints and the risk of being sent back to the U.S.
Most of the people who walk in cross where a rural dead end in New York meets the Canadian border here at Roxham Road. When we came in February, this was gravel. The Mounties responded to sporadic crossings. Now they've erected tents and simply wait.
As we are living a lot of uncertainty about immigration reform in the U.S., what's going to happen
happen with DACA or what's going to happen also with calls for even a smaller intake of refugees.
Advocates say it's the contrast between the Trump administration's hardline stance on immigration versus the welcoming image projected by Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau that drives many to Canada, though they warn there is no guarantee that status will be granted.
The government has been accused of misleading migrants and telling them that things would be easier than they might sound.
Outside a YMCA in Montreal, where migrants are housed, it's a melting pot of cultures. Families from Syria, alongside men from Haiti and Africa, all await hearings. We spoke to people who stopped in America first, but believe their best shot at refuge lies in Canada.
My hope for the future is to seek a better life, a better future, a place where I can be free.
Prime Minister Trudeau is slated to visit Washington next week, but the official focus of his meeting with President Trump is expected to be on international security and trade as NAFTA negotiations continue. Brett?
Molly Lime, live in Montreal. Molly, thanks. Another storm is headed for the U.S. Tropical storm Nate formed off the coast of Nicaragua today. It is expected to drench parts of Central America and Mexico before potentially hitting the U.S. Gulf Coast as a hurricane. Yes, another hurricane over the weekend. Up next, strength in numbers, whether the latest economic indicators mean the financial crisis is finally behind us. President Trump pointed to the stronger economy this morning in a tweet, writing, "Stock market hits an all-time high, unemployment lowest in 16 years, business and manufacturing enthusiasm at highest level in decades." And today, the gains continued. The Dow grew 114, the S&P 500 jumped 14, the Nasdaq was up 51. So does this mean the economy is back on track after struggling to break from the financial crisis? Fox Business Network's Trish Regan is in New York tonight, maybe with some answers. Good evening, Trish.
Hey, good evening, Brett. Yeah, there's a lot of good signs out there. I mean, you point to the stock market, we can point to GDP prints, we can point to a low unemployment rate. There's a lot of reason to be optimistic right now, and investors are feeling this optimism. I think there's a sense overall within this economy and within the Wall Street sector that business is being put front and forward. And there's a sense that this administration cares very much about things like tax policy. And so you're seeing all this optimism. We're also seeing fundamental growth, economic earnings that are improving significantly within a lot of these corporations. So all of that is pointing to higher direction for the stock market.
September's job numbers and the reports out tomorrow. So what are the economists anticipating?
This is going to be interesting. I think this is going to be a little bit different than what we have been seeing, in that you may not see hundreds of thousands of jobs being added. The expectation is for roughly 90,000, Brett. And the reason for that is, of course, because of the hurricanes. Those will have a temporary effect on the economy. They did temporarily hurt hiring. So do anticipate then that will not be as strong as we've previously seen. But hopefully we'll see a rebound in the following month. So maybe it'll be just a one-off. But certainly there's a lot of good things out there. The one caveat to all of this I would point out, Brett, is that the Fed, remember all the money printing that they had engaged in over the last 8 years? They still need to unwind that balance sheet. And if they start doing that and buying up some of this securities and debt that they previously had put out there, then that could actually be a risk. But fundamentally, the economy is stronger.
Okay, good news. Trish, thanks. Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin's government plane travel was all above board. That's according to the department's Inspector General. Today, the report came out, did find that Mnuchin's office could have done a better job at justifying why he needed to use the more expensive modes of travel on 7 separate occasions. His office says they will do a better job of explaining their needs in the future. Virginia voters may be the first to make their voices heard on gun control, as that issue takes on new urgency following Sunday's shooting in Las Vegas. Next month, residents of the Commonwealth will vote for a new governor. Right now, Real Clear Politics average puts Democratic candidate Ralph Northam on 5 points ahead of Republican challenger Ed Gillespie. Correspondent Doug McElway reports tonight on whether a state full of firm believers in the Second Amendment could change the state of that race.
The Las Vegas massacre may add a red-hot issue to a bellwether election, the Virginia gubernatorial race on November 7th between Republican Ed Gillespie.
I'm a believer and a strong defender of our Second Amendment individual right to keep and bear arms.
And Democrat Ralph Northam.
There is no excuse that we have assault weapons on our streets.
Virginia is no stranger to the gun control debate. In 2007, student Sung-Hee Cho shot and killed 32 people at Virginia Tech in what was then America's worst slaughter by a gunman. The tragedy uncovered a domino effect of lapses. Before he acted out, many students, professors, and campus police had warned of Cho. A state court found him mentally defective. But reporting gaps meant that he was never placed on the National Instant Criminal Background Check system. So he was able to buy 2 guns. A Virginia law in place at the time, signed by Democratic Governor Doug Wilder in 1993, limited gun purchases to 1 a month. But that was repealed in 2012 under the Republican administration of Governor Bob McDonnell. The seesaw nature of Virginia's gun control mood reflects the state's fundamental divide, one that also exists across the U.S.
The rural areas in Virginia already vote heavily Republican. It's hard to see them increasing that percentage because it's so high already. The people who are for gun control are in the bluest, most democratic cities and suburbs of Virginia. I don't see it as a tipping point one way or the other.
The polls have mostly been within the margin of error, with the Democrat leading, but a Washington Post poll out just today, conducted after Las Vegas, shows Democrat Northam pulling ahead by 13 points. As with other statewide races in Virginia, this race may be decided by the Northern Virginia swing counties, like here in Fairfax or Prince William County, Loudoun, Fauquier counties. And it may not be over gun control as much as the bread and butter issues of education, jobs, and the economy. Brett?
Doug, thank you. Hollywood mega producer and big-time Democratic fundraiser Harvey Weinstein is taking a leave of absence from his company after a detailed report by the New York Times chronicled decades of sexual harassment against women. Times cites first-person accounts from actresses like Ashley Judd, who says Weinstein invited her to his hotel room and asked her to watch him shower, to employees who say the studio executive tried to get them to give him naked massages. Weinstein's attorney says the article is, quote, saturated with false and defamatory statements. Decision day looms on the Iran nuclear deal. The White House shoots down more of so-called fake news. What is real? The All-Star panel is next.
We'll have a recommendation for the president. We're going to give him a couple of options of how to move forward to advance the important policy towards Iran.
The president has, as he said, made a decision on this, and he'll make that announcement at the appropriate time. The main focus that he has had has been a comprehensive strategy on how to deal with Iran. That is what he wanted his team to put in place, and I think you will see that announced in short order, and that will be a comprehensive strategy with a unified team behind him supporting that effort.
And we heard from the president this hour in the cabinet room meeting with military officials and his defense secretary that you will hear something on Iran very soon. This as multiple reports here in Washington are suggesting that the White House, the president specifically, will decertify this deal, including the Washington Post with the headline, Trump plans to declare that Iran nuclear deal is not in the national interests. White House pushing back on the specifics, saying nothing's set in stone, but clearly something is happening soon. The deadline is October 15th. Let's bring in our panel. Fox News senior judicial analyst, Judge Andrew Napolitano, Catherine Lucy, White House reporter for the Associated Press, and Michael Crowley, senior foreign affairs correspondent for Politico. It seems like it's heading in a way, Michael, as you talk to the experts around town, that it will be something short of pulling all the way out of the Iran nuclear deal and essentially handing it to Congress to say it's your deal to deal with sanctions or not.
Yeah, absolutely. So an important thing for people to understand is that Donald Trump has to, any president, whoever had won the election, would have to certify every 90 days whether Iran is complying with the deal. And if Trump says that they are not, that doesn't mean we're at, excuse me, It doesn't mean we're out of the deal or that the deal is off. It starts a clock for Congress, and Congress has 60 days to decide as a result of that presidential action, are you going to reimpose the sanctions that we lifted when Barack Obama did this deal in July of 2015 was a trade. We'll take off sanctions if you, the Iranians, will put strict limits on your nuclear program. If Congress does that, then the deal is basically blown up. America has, in effect, withdrawn from the deal, and there are a lot of consequences. The most extreme version you hear from some Obama officials is this starts us down the path to war. But what looks like what's going to happen is Trump is going to decertify it, get to sort of vent about it. He doesn't like the deal, but I think he's been convinced by his more sort of establishment mainstream advisors like Mattis, McMaster, Tillerson, that pulling out of it now brings consequences he doesn't want to deal with. So he gets to decertify, but then Congress doesn't follow through, and it's a compromise between the politics and the policy.
And maybe during that time they try to push for some kind of renegotiation on some elements of the Iran deal. I guess that's the hope.
That's certainly possible. I mean, here's what we know. The president hates this deal. He's been vocal about his dislike for it. And what we're hearing is that there is, as Michael was saying, discussion privately about how to sort of split the difference, give him the ability to say he's taking action while not necessarily fully exiting. And that then does turn to Congress. It does probably involve negotiation. We're not fully clear yet how it's all going to play out, but he does get to then, if he does it this way, which they're saying is not definite, he gets to make a statement about this.
Judge, there's firm pushback against the NBC reporting on Secretary Tillerson yesterday by the White House, by the president, but there's not denying that there is a split in the administration on this issue. Here's a listen to Defense Secretary Mattis and others.
Do you believe it's in our national security interest at the present time to remain in the JCPOA? That's a yes or no question.
Yes, Senator, I do. The president has to consider more broadly things that rightly fall under his portfolio of looking out for the American people in areas that go beyond the specific letters of the JCPOA. In that regard, I support the rigorous review that he has got going on right now.
What I testified to last week was that Iran is not in material breach of the agreement, and I do believe the agreement to date has delayed the development of a nuclear capability by Iran.
But U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, has kind of tended to have a tone that was different.
I do not remember witnessing the senior most members of an administration disagreeing so publicly. Now, the president likes to go it alone. He wants to feed the base. He wants to do, as president, what he said he was going to do in very vociferous terms when he was a candidate. But you have the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, and the National Security Advisor, three of the four of them generals or former generals, saying Iran is doing the right thing. It'll be catastrophic for us diplomatically if you pull out of this. Don't go it alone. And you have all the other countries. There's 7 countries in this deal. It's not just Iran and us. All the others have said Iran is materially complying with the agreement. So I think there's going to be consequences, even if he strikes the deal that Michael talked about. But I do think he's going to do what Michael said he was going to do.
Which is why it could be consistent. You could have rhetoric like that from Mattis and Tillerson saying Iran is in compliance, but Trump will decertify but not have Congress pass the sanctions, so we don't pull out of the deal. We actually preserve the deal, even though for the base, Trump is able to kind of send a message saying, I still hate this thing.
But how about this? How tough is that vote?
Generals, what message they send then to the countries, to the allies?
How tough is that vote for Republicans who said this Iran deal was horrible too?
Very, very tough. And at some point, the president has to sign some legislation, either pro-sanctions or against sanctions. So at some point, he's going to have to bite the bullet.
A lot of Democrats didn't like the deal too, but they're in a tough spot.
That's right. Next up, about legislation, some agreement in the gun control debate. Is it a big step forward or much ado about nothing?